Get started. I'm Dr. Kirsten Abel, a representative from the College of Education. Thank you for joining us tonight. We have Dr. Wilson Okello, who is an assistant professor at Penn State University, joining us from Pennsylvania. He's an artist and an interdisciplinary scholar who draws on Black critical theory to advance research on student and early adult development theory. So he joins us today for this year's TIDE conference. And his presentation is titled Towards a Revolution of Values. Thank you for joining us.
Okay. All right, wonderful. Hopefully folks can see that screen. It is a gift. It's a gift to be before you on this afternoon, evening. Lift up your eyes upon the day breaking before you, give birth again to the dream. Women, children, men, take it into the palms of your hands, mold it into the shape of your most private need, sculpt it into the image of your most public self. Lift up your hearts. Each new hour holds new chances for new beginnings. Do not be wedded forever to fear or yoked eternally to brutishness. The horizon leans forward, offering us space to place new steps of change here on the pulse of this new day. May you have the courage to look up and out and upon the rock, the river, the tree, your country here on the pulse of this fine day. May you have the grace to look into your sister's eyes, to look upon your brother's face and say simply, very simply with hope, good morning. And again, to you all, I say good afternoon, good evening. My name is Wilson Okello. My pronouns are he, him. I join you from Pennsylvania, from State College, Pennsylvania, where we have a 73-degree day. Not rare for you all, but for us, we will take it in what is a fluctuating climate. Pennsylvania, State College, Pennsylvania State University, they're located on the original homelands of the Erie, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, Susquehannock nations, and the Shawnee people. These nations were forcefully removed from their traditional territories, and these lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. Indeed, we all have a particular obligation to recognize the people of these lands and histories of dispossession upon which the university as an idea rests. In an effort for me to continually consider place and space, I also need to recognize higher education institutions writ large as multi-generational sites of violence and dispossession, whereas African ascendant people were sold, traded, and subject to the violence of massacre. For me, grappling with space, with time, with history, the work of memory is part and parcel of how we ought to think about and contextualize our living and our work. And so again, I'm grateful for the opportunity to join and contribute to this really important conversation that you all are having at the nexus of ethics, diversity, and globalism. Thank you, Dr. Abel, Dr. Anderson, the College of Education at Clemson University, and really the entire TIDE conference planning team that has made this convening possible. I'm really excited to be part of the conversation. If I could borrow your time for just a short time on this afternoon, evening, I would begin by taking you to East Africa in 1983. And there we would find a woman named Leslie Scott. That year, Leslie Scott, she launched a game at the London Toy Fair that would go on to become one of the best-selling products in the toy industry's history. In 2017, it was noted that this game had sold more than 80 million units worldwide, sustaining popularity among children and adults. Even if you don't actively play this game, I am almost certain that you have heard of it. Scott, she conceptualized the game with her family in the 1970s using children's wooden blocks. The name thus derives from the Swahili term, which means to build. Right? This game is played with 54 wooden blocks. Each block is stacked 3 3 blocks at a time. The blocks have various dimensions to them. Blocks have small random variations to create this sort of imperfection in the stacking process, which makes the game more challenging. The game, of course, is called, I'm not in person, but I can almost hear some of you saying Jenga. That's right, from the Swahili word, which means kujenga. As many of you know, the rectangular blocks are first stacked 3 layers at a time, right? From there, players take turns removing the blocks from anywhere under the top layer. Once removed, the blocks are then placed on the top layer. The game continues until the tower or any portion thereof falls. The last player who successfully removes a block from the tower before it falls is declared the winner. It's been reported that the tallest Jenga tower has stood at almost 40 2/3 level high. If you're doing the math, that means the tower was more than 2 times its beginning height. Now, I was born and raised in an East African home where my father was intimately familiar with this game. We played the game quite a bit as a family. My older brother, my younger sister, we would gather with my parents around the coffee table in the living room, and we carefully, constructed this 18-story tower 3 blocks at a time. We took great pride in engineering this tower. It's as if we were bricklayers. We stacked and we pressed each brick, ensuring that there were no imperfections in the design. We would often take a step back and look at our creation, wondering if we had ever seen something so magnificent. And then the game started. If you recall, the purpose of the game, as told by the designer of the product, was to build the tallest tower possible by pulling blocks from anywhere and then stacking them, right, such that we might be able to attain a taller tower. The title of the game, of course, is called To Build. And by and large, my brother, my sister, my mother, we all resonated with the rules of the game as explained and approached the game accordingly. We took great care to ensure that the blocks that we pulled from this structure would not compromise the entire tower. If 3 blocks made up a layer, we'd attempt to dislodge the center block so that the structure could rely on 2 sturdy ends to keep the tower upright. My father, however, seemed to have a different understanding of the rules, right? So much to our ire and our confusion even, he would look for what those in masonry might call the cornerstone, right? Or the block that was set first. The cornerstone was important. It is critical because the cornerstone was set in reference to all of the other stones. As my father understood it, the cornerstone was significant because it could tell you about the integrity of a structure. If the cornerstone was placed incorrectly or was off in any way, then the tower was already compromised. My father would pull at end blocks closer to the base of the tower. Oftentimes he was successful, right? Pulling the blocks and then replacing them at the top of the structure. But the rest of us were not so fortunate. Once he pulled the block from the tower had a noticeable lean and sway, which typically meant that the next person to engage the structure would almost certainly be responsible for collapsing the structure. In this way, my father was oftentimes declared the winner. My siblings and I would oftentimes look at the pile of rubble, simply shake our heads. Seeing our dejected responses, my mother would look at my father and say, "Seraphim, why do you do that?" My father would simply laugh. He would watch us rebuild. And notice I said he would watch us rebuild. He never actually assisted us after he collapsed the tower. And I may still have some feelings about that, but I'm much clearer about what I believe was happening. See, my father understood something that we didn't. He knew that if your structure was fundamentally flawed, then no matter how smooth its surface or how clean its edges, if and when it is provoked, it will collapse. See, perhaps he remembered that the wooden blocks had slight imperfections in them, which meant that though we couldn't see it, the towers that we took so much pride in already had a compromised foundation. I can now confess that it was not my father who was bringing down the towers. The towers that we held up and took so much pride in were already falling. They were already leaning. I didn't have the language for it in that particular moment, but my father was teaching me something about values and the things, the ideas, the ways of being and doing that we give priority to in our lives. Our policies, our practices in higher education, in our own lives, sometimes in our profession, like the wooden blocks of Jenga, are inherently flawed. Sometimes they place value in ideas and ways of being and doing life that work for some, but largely hinder and harm most people. Like my siblings and I, too many of us are only interested in continuing to build on this shaky foundation, no matter how many times we have told, right? We've been told that they are not working. And most assuredly, we have been told every single time these policies and these practices fail, they are collapsing not on the individuals with power, but they are collapsing on the most vulnerable among us. The answer for many people and organizations is to tell people like my father that they can no longer play because they refuse to comply with the instability, that they refuse to participate in our simple sort of act of building, because they disrupt what we are trying to accomplish. Instead of staring at the rubble, staring at the pile of blocks, staring at the pile of bricks and rebuilding something new, something different. As a general rule, I think crisis leaves us leaves an unpredictable mark on us, leaves an unpredictable mark on history. If we're sticking with this analogy, chaos, like fallen Jenga towers, provides space for us to think about approaching the game differently. When playing the game, for example, I've witnessed individuals revise their strategies, right? People will switch spots, people will change who follows who, folks will pull different blocks, hoping for a steadier result. At this moment, I'm trying to think about what it means to revolutionize our process. Instead of attempting to build toward a particular goal with materials that we know are flawed, we might enlist a different set of tools that could help us shape materials differently. We might enlist a set of questions committed to process. We might dare to engage in ethics of pause. In this constant march of time, as really sort of understood in these Western frameworks that we live in, notions of pause are frowned upon. They're oftentimes viewed as bad, right? Pauses means missing deadlines. It means that someone somewhere else is doing some more work than we are. I want to submit to you that pause, this notion of stillness, can be useful. And even in this moment, where we are sort of swept up in the nonstop stimulation of tweets, of status updates, of deadlines, of competing for others' attention, and that this notion of pause might be useful for us. If we're thinking about this notion of pause, I want to draw your attention to what folks in geology might understand as a shoal, right? The shoal, I think, is a really interesting sort of geological structure. It can be defined as an area in which a body of water becomes shallow. It's the process. It's the movement of the ocean from greater to shallower depths. It's not the shore. It's a formation or series of formations that a vessel encounters before the shore or just offshore. We might understand it as the accumulation of particular materials like sand, like rocks, right? That make it difficult to cross or to pass. And thus it's a physical space, a shallower place in the ocean before one arrives on the particular shore. Again, the shoal's expanse, density, its shape, its change over time, it provides us with a moment to say that this is a place where we need to stop, perhaps change direction. It's a place where we might adjust. And I want to submit to you that it's a place where we might even occasion a full stop. Lee Patel talks about this notion of pause as a productive interruption of competitive ways of being, of doing, of knowing. Pauses, I think, hold the potential for learning within them. I think an ethic of pause might invite us to get away from an outcome-oriented society and to begin to sort of think about process. It might ask this important question that I want to grapple with throughout this afternoon, evening. Where do we go from here? Where do we go from here remains, I believe, one of the most consequential questions of our time. I've encountered many folks, many organizations, right, that say that they are committed to big ideas like freedom and justice for all, even though they live the values and habits of being that help to reproduce cultures of domination. Habits and values that they live help to create and keep up an unfree world, right? This happens in several ways that I would argue have spilled out into what we are experiencing in our global world. We absolutely must consider this question of where we are going. Where do we go from here? As important as the where question is, I think there is a more pressing question that confronts us, and that is this sort of question of how. How, I believe, again, is a question of process and practice. I believe that we can cultivate practices for finding each other in a shifting world. We can create an intentional approach to what we take in and to what we pull out. I love what Alexis Gumbs talks about as the intergenerational and evolutionary ways that we can become what we practice. How can we navigate environments with core practices that build community, that build resistance, and more loving ways of living? She talks about dorsal fins, if we're thinking about dolphins and whales. The function of dorsal fins for aquatic animals is really about stability, right? In water that is always moving, having a dorsal fin provides balance, it provides autonomy and support for the swift turns, right, that we might have to make in the ocean of life. She asked, what are the intergenerational practices that have generated dorsal fins in some dolphins and whales, right? Because unlike fish, they don't have the bones that support a dorsal fin, right? The mammals they evolved from and before it's sort of returning to the ocean didn't have dorsal fins. They aren't a vestige of limbs like tails or side fins. The prevailing explanation is that dolphins evolved the dense tissue that became dorsal fins because they needed to in order to live in the wild environment and movement of the ocean. In other words, dolphins evolved dorsal fins from practice across generations by accepting that the ocean would always move and becoming accordingly, right? An embodied emphasis, I think, is really sort of concentrated on in this idea because it points to the ways in which we need to take up the very thing that we want to become, right? Dolphins, like other mammals, shifted their process to become what they needed to become in order for their entire sort of species to survive. In a context, right, that swells and tosses me around, where might I sort of pivot without much, where I think many of us are forced to pivot without warning. I think we need to cultivate and sort of evolve some practices that will help to stabilize us, that will help us to cut through some of the noise of life, that will help us to cut through some of the things that are literally contending for our humanity. What are the ethics and values that will stabilize us in this particular moment, that will allow us, again, to cut through the noise of culture and systems of oppression? I submit to you that we need something like a dorsal fin. We need a set of values, I believe, to direct us differently. And I think that we can make and we can create those ethics if we practice, only if we practice. In 1968, Martin King, he writes about this revolution of values, right? He talks about the stability of the large world house, which is ours, will involve what he calls a revolution of values. To accompany the scientific and the freedom revolutions that are engulfing the earth, we must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, from a thing-oriented society to a person and a more humane-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, systems of oppression like racism, like materialism, sexism, like militarism are incapable, right, of being conquered. I want to suggest to you that in many ways, we are starving for ethical valuation, which is to say our sense of ethics has more to do with power and justification than it does about a public sense of goodness. We are living in an unsettled moment, uncertain about the possibility of building and sustaining community. I think the individuals we often look to, the public figures who are talking most about these ideas are talking about them from a simplistic set of individualistic ideals, right? They're committed to maintaining systems of domination like racism, like sexism, like class exploitation that promote this sort of perverse vision of freedom that makes it synonymous with accumulation, right? Materialism, gaining more. They teach us to believe that domination is natural, right? That capitalism and the haves and have-nots is somehow normal and ordinary. What amazes me is that so many people claim to not embrace these particular values, and yet our collective rejection of them cannot be complete as they prevail in our daily lives, right? And so even as we espouse this sense that this is not working for us, we continue to sort of take them up in our lives, right? These days, for me, I'm really compelled to consider the forces that are keeping us, right, from actually pursuing a revolution of values. How do we engender something different, right? What should be our dorsal practices? What evolutionary repetitions do we need to cultivate so that we can move through the world differently? What are the ones we need to cultivate for the waves that are coming against us, even in this particular moment? When I consider these questions, and I really want to sort of invite you to consider them as well, and what we're being charged with as leaders in your community, in your fields, in your organizations, in your various domains, I want us to sort of think about habits that we might be able to cultivate to move toward a more sustainable future. I affirm that we have the capacity to do it, but again, I think we need models, possibility models for what this might look like. And in order to home in on a possibility model, I want to spend just a few moments talking about one that I continue to draw on, one that I think is consistently understudied and undervalued, largely because of the type of leadership that they embraced and chose to live out with purpose. I want to spend some time thinking about this individual called the individual known as Ella Jo Baker. Ella Baker was born in 1903 in North Carolina. Right. She had grandparents who were enslaved. As a girl, Baker listened to her grandmother tell stories about slave revolts. Her mother was a former teacher and deeply religious. She tutored Ella at home and coached her in public speaking. As a child, Ella was part of a supportive and tightly knit Black community where friends, relatives, and neighbors helped each other out. Her grandfather mortgaged the family farm to help feed families in need. For high school, Baker's parents sent her to a boarding school affiliated with what we understand now as Shaw University. She remained at Shaw for college, edited with the student newspaper, graduated as class valedictorian in 1927. Her political activism began in Harlem in the 1930s. She worked with cooperative movements during the Great Depression. She supported the campaign against Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, as opposed to the racist conviction that was sort of the prevailing attitude in society. She really sort of warred against these ideals. Right. The suffering that was brought on by things like the Great Depression troubled her deeply. And so she spent time in and with communities. She worked on behalf of tenants and consumers. She worked with the Young Negroes Cooperative League and became its national director. The group sponsored cooperative buying clubs, grocery stores that helped to produce sort of affordable prices for individuals in the communities, right? Baker, she was a field secretary for the NAACP in the 1940s. She traveled throughout the Jim Crow South, organizing against discrimination, recruiting people to the civil rights movement. She worked alongside King and others during this civil rights moment. Baker, as a strategist, she was an organizer and mother to the movement. She would often talk about the ways that grassroots leadership was necessary in order to move society forward. She talked about strong people not needing a strong leader, warning activists to really sort of move away from the messianic idea of saviors to build local leaders by the thousands. I love what she said. She said that Martin King, for example, didn't make the movement. Rather, the movement made mark. She did not mean to be disparaging in this particular moment. I believe she was casting a more hopeful idea that individuals, a collective, had the power to sort of change their situation, the strength and determination of ordinary people, right? The power of organizations that they build together can be a locus of power. Excuse me. Baker, she was not interested in this sort of elite strategy. She was, excuse me, she was committed to this hard and I believe serious work of, again, representing people. She wanted to move away from, like I mentioned, this notion of lifting up the one individual such that we might be able to mobilize communities, develop campaigns, create new organizers. Baker's leadership style influenced individuals across her tenure. She is someone whose life and legacy extended across decades. She influenced individuals that we understand now as the great Fannie Lou Hamer. She influenced individuals and organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. As I mentioned, the NAACP, she worked with throughout the 50s and the 60s. She was literally in the business of cultivating young people such that they might become the leaders that our communities so desperately needed. She represented a different tradition, particularly at this moment, of leadership altogether. She combined this generic idea of leadership, right? The process of social influence in which a person can enlist the aid and support of others in the accomplishment of a task and of work, right? With this sort of infused confidence, right, in the wisdom of ordinary people to define their problems and to imagine solutions. We have the power to define problems and to imagine solutions. Communities can define their own problems and they can imagine solutions. The collective effort, I think, if we are to move toward a series of habits that will move us forward, that will help to stabilize us as we move into the future. I believe that Baker's leadership style offers us a minimum 4 habits that we can begin to sort of emulate and practice. And I want to sort of talk about those very briefly in the time that remains. She talks about, or her leadership really sort of embodies this notion of what it means to be consistent, what it means to be consequential, what it means to be or invest in the collective, and then what it means to be courageous. This sort of revolution of values that King and many others during this particular sort of moment we're talking about embraced in the very leadership of Ella Baker, call on us to think about habits that are consistent, that are consequential, that are collective, and are courageous. And as I sort of move through these 4, I want to invite you to think through a series of questions and ideas. Number 1, this idea of consistency. I'm most interested in how we hold ourselves accountable to the commitments that we make in our life and in our work. Right? Personally, within your office, within your particular domain, what are the intentional behaviors, norms that inform how you treat each other, how you treat one another, right? What values represent the ideals that you want to live up to, right? What norms are acceptable behaviors? What are the attitudes that we not only espouse, but that we take up, that we want to be socially enforced? Right? In a culture, I think, of accountability and consistency, norms begin to sort of set the standard for what an anti-racist practice can be, right? They set clear boundaries in relationships, accountability, right? Consistency, structures help us to define norms that might be honored, right? Once standards are established, everyone can then begin to sort of take part in those standards, including the most powerful person in the room. These individuals to become accountable to those standards. I want to submit to you that accountability, this notion of consistency, is much less about what happens after, say, a major event has already occurred. after an event or an incident, people in parties are mostly interested in reacting in some way, right? We're attempting to find some sense of stability, managing egos and reputations and the like. But I think consistency from the start, right? Having a form of accountability allows us to reframe how we go about uh, ultimately how our culture unfolds before and even after a particular incident might take place, right? So it asks us to invest in this daily sort of commitment to what are we doing to hold ourselves to the particular values that we have espoused, the norms that we have espoused, right? What does our daily reflection time look like as it relates to some of the ideas that we are putting forth as an organization, or again, as individuals, right? So if we talk about, for example, what it means to embrace equity as an individual and as an organization, are we deeply invested in reflecting on what this should look like in my own life? Is the organization deeply invested in what this looks like in our daily practices, in our hiring, in how we treat one another, right? Right? What is the work of reflection in the organization such that, again, we're not just working around espoused ideas, but we're taking the time to deeply invest in what those could look like. So for one moment, I want us to sort of just take about 2 minutes. And I want you to brainstorm how you can model a form of care to the things that you hold sacred in your life. Think about things that you hold sacred. Right? And these can be relationships. It can be thinking about the ways that we want to care for our bodies. We want to care for our communities. It could be thinking about our spiritual practice. Whatever it is that you hold sacred, I want you to just make a list of those things. And as you brainstorm, I want you to begin to sort of think about what a model of care would look like, right? How might you care for these sacred components of your life, right? Of your organization, right? Of your community, such that they become, again, more than just something that we name, but something that we are actively committed to practicing, right? Taking up the sort of praxis of consistency, such that, again, it becomes a simple way of how we move in the world. So I want you to just take 2 minutes, think about the things you hold sacred, and then we will circle back and we will keep moving from there. So we'll take 2 minutes. Take about 1 minute. Okay. Wonderful. Consistency. How are we holding ourselves accountable to the very commitments that we are making in our life, in our world, in our communities, right? Consistency. The second idea that I want to spend just a few moments talking about is this notion of what it means to do consequential work, right? I think if our leadership, right, if our movement in the world for social change, before we even get to social change, if our movement in the world is not improving in some way the material lives of people, right, then I think we have to ask ourselves if we are truly doing a work of consequence. Right? Baker was deeply reflective about what she wanted her contribution to be, right? She thought of herself as really functioning to meet the needs of a particular people. She was deeply concerned, not with the limelight, right? Not with the award, not with the recognition, but what it meant to come alongside people in some fundamental and serious way, right? She was connected with the NAACP at a time when being a part of an organization like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, NAACP, right? These were grounds for particular types of attack, for hostility, right? She remembers being part of communities of people that encountered hostility from the police, from citizens who are oftentimes wielded by the state in some really particular ways, right? And so, but she was deeply, again, invested in what it meant to come alongside individuals in ways that was beyond the superficial, beyond the sort of cursory, right? And so when I think about this work of consequence, I'm oftentimes asking myself, what do we need to refuse, right, in my life or in our lives, such that we can affirm and manifest a consequential form of living? When I think about this notion of refusal, an ethic of refusal, I'm thinking about what it means to reject the status quo as livable, right? It is not livable. This is not something that individuals can inhabit, right? But not just stopping at that particular moment. I think refusal is a rejection of the status quo as livable and the creation of possibility in the face of negation. I love how Tina Kemp thinks about this idea. What does it mean to think about refusing that which is not livable, but also sort of creating in the face of negation? I think this creation in the face of negation is what it looks like to affirm other possibilities, to affirm what scholars might talk about as an otherwise form of living, right? In a shifting world, I believe that our affirmations can help to anchor us. Intentions can help us to feel some sense of stability amidst uncertainty. Intentions, I believe, are a way to articulate how we want to feel, how we want to be, how we want to move at any particular moment, as we move sort of, in any sort of particular day. And so I'm thinking about how do we sort of take up, what are we refusing in our lives, right? Such that we can affirm and manifest an otherwise form of being. I would invite you to think about what needs to be refused in your own life, right? This is something I attempt to sort of take up every day. I have a soon-to-be 2-year-old, and part of our morning ritual is to not only reflect on our dreams, but to think about what we are affirming for the day. And so with my 2-year-old, oftentimes, if I ask what he desires for the day, in this particular moment, it might be breakfast. It might be applesauce. It might be a particular toy, and that's fine for this particular moment. But what I'm hoping is that the consistency, right, the habit of thinking about how we want to approach our day, the habit of making a deliberate decision to approach our day in a particular way, will begin to sort of be taken up in a different way as he grows, as he matures, that he has the capacity to act on the world in some very powerful ways. And so what are we refusing such that we can affirm and manifest a consequential form of living, consequential, collective, and consistency and consequential habits, I think, become really important. This third idea of collective, or thinking about the collective, in what ways are you supporting someone in living into their possibility? I think one of the most difficult components of shifting our values is defining the we. I think in our current sort of economic and social order, it's made it such that some folks are interested in their plot, their land, their family, this sense of me, right? I think it's hard to figure out what we are fighting for when we can't figure out who we is, right? So what happens when there is no we? I think this is a question that cuts across nation, class, ethnicity. And to be honest, I don't know that I have a particular answer for it, but I do know this, that if the people who are in this Zoom room and in person at Clemson University, if the individuals in these rooms, if we don't prioritize one another, right? If we don't prioritize what it means to sort of come alongside one another, then we all lose, right? Period, full stop, right? I think we need to give up these simplified understandings of what community looks like and begin to sort of think with Baker about a notion of sacrifice. What does sacrifice look like as connected to community? We have not collectively practiced a critical form of citizenship such that it's hard for us to understand, I think, its significance. But I think if we implement a new practice that is centered on care, on dignity, I think we can find a practice that challenges us to against, I should say, moving away from one another, right? From canceling one another. It's not to suggest that individuals, every individual is right, or that individuals don't make mistakes. But I submit to you that I think a critical form of community is invested, I think, in a hard struggling together, right? Particularly when things get difficult. And so I want to sort of think about pushing this idea of what it means to be part of a collective as notions of sacrifice and sort of really taking up this idea of critical citizenship. How are we invested in supporting individuals that we are doing life with such that they might live into their possibility, and not just the individuals that we like, that we affirm, that do well for us, but how can we help other individuals to live into their possibility? Consistency, what it means to sort of do consequential work, this notion of the collective, and then this notion of what it means to be courageous. I think this idea of courage, what is the area of growth for you right now? What would be a brave action in relationship to the area of growth? Could it mean sort of reaching out for support if you usually go it alone? Could it be sort of taking a pause when you are conditioned to sort of keep moving in unhealthy ways? What is the sort of courageous motion? What is the courageous act that we need to sort of take? I think this is hard work. Courage requires something of us. In many ways, it's a willingness, I think, to do this hard work of self-examination, right? I think it's a felt commitment to look at conditions of our life, conditions of our communities without turning away, right? It's recognizing that there is something required of us in order to move a community forward, and being willing, not again, this sort of erasure of fear, but willing to sort of move in and against notions of fear, right? And so again, what is the area of growth for you as you think about what it means to be courageous, right? What would a brave action look like in your own life? I think as we sort of think about these values, these habits of being, of what it means to be consistent, what it means to think about the consequential work required of us, what it means to do collective or invest in a collective, what it means to sort of be courageous, can help move us, can help to stabilize us, again, in this sort of very shifting oceanic world that we exist in at this moment. So as we take these habits, I want to leave you with three sort of fundamental questions that I invite my students, I invite myself to continue to ponder as we consider how we might move differently in the world. Those simple questions are: number one, what do you want? Number two, what power do you have? Number three, what are you willing to give up? Number one, what do you want? Number two, what power do you have? And number three, what are you willing to give up? And with my last sort of 15 minutes, I just want to sort of reflect on these three questions. When I sort of think about this first question of what do I want? More specifically, what do I want my words, my thoughts, my very presence to accomplish, right? I think it's important to name the thing that we desire, to speak the thing into reality, right? And in imagining the world that we want, I think I want to invite you to think about what it means to dream. To dream differently. I talked about these sort of practices, these rituals I'm attempting to cultivate with my son. I ask him two questions every morning. The first question is, what did you dream about? The second question is, what do you desire for the day? It's important for me to remind this little Black boy that he has dreams that are worth honoring. And then against a world that will oftentimes refuse the dreams of minoritized folks, what does it mean to invite ourselves to dream, and to dream expansively, to dream of otherwise worlds, right? Freedom dreaming, as some folks might call it, is a tool that invites us to create the world that we dream by first visualizing the future that we want to live, and then second, determining the actions that will lead us there. Visualizing the future that we want to live, and then second, determining the actions that will lead us there. This type of dreaming, I think, compels the dreamer, right, and those who are in community with that particular dreamer toward intentionality and toward thoughtfully participating in this sort of project of world making. How are we all invested in visualizing this future that we want to live in? And then we can begin to sort of take the steps, the actions to move us in that direction. Freedom dreaming, I think, reminds us, right, to actively continue to uplift, right, the deep ways we are connected to complex lives, stories, histories of those around us. I think freedom dreaming is an affirmation of identity across ability, across gender, identity, sexuality, stages of healing, socioeconomic class. It's an affirmation that how we come to a particular place matters, right? How do we honor the dreams and how they come along? How do we honor the dreams of individuals who have gone before us and take those up in meaningful ways? How do our dreams come alongside those that we are in community with? I think freedom dreaming is an effort to connect people and communities, right? To create shared notions of visions with one another, right? Freedom dreaming, I wanted us to sort of think about, what is it that you dream about? What do you dream about? What is the content of those dreams? What do you desire? What do you want your very presence to accomplish? As you think about what it means to move in and across the Clemson University community, the College of Education, what do you hope your very presence accomplishes in that space, in that world? I know some of the phenomenal people at Clemson University, and I'm thinking about how these individuals move and what their very presence helps to create, what it stimulates, the ideas and sort of world making that you invite as you think about, or as they move in and across the environment. And so again, for all the folks who are present, I want us to sort of grapple, to think for a minute about what it is that we hope, that we want our sort of presence to accomplish as we move in and through various spaces. I want us to just sort of take another 2 minutes to grapple with this question. What is it that we desire? You don't have to answer all three questions, but I just want to focus on this last question in particular for a moment. What do you want your very presence to accomplish? as you move through space, as you move through time, at the university, but also beyond? What is it, right? When folks think about you, what comes to mind, right? What are they allowed to envision? What are they permitted to consider? What do you want your presence to accomplish? Take about 2 minutes to reflect on this question, and we'll come back together. Take about 1 minute. What do you want your presence to accomplish? I want you to hold on to that question, to revisit it from time to time. And so too, the content of your dreams and your desires, and what it looks like for you. What would it look like for you to sort of take these up in active ways, right? And so again, thinking about what it means to do this work of dreaming or freedom. Dreaming, it's inviting us to create the world that we desire, or that we dream, by first visualizing the future that we want to live in, and then second, determining the actions that are necessary to move toward that particular dream. What is it that you want? Number two, this question of what power do you have? I love what Alice Walker says. The most common way that we give up our power is by thinking that we don't have any. Power is simply the ability to shape reality, to give meaning to it. It's something that I believe that we all possess, irrespective of the energy we might spend contending that we are powerless. Why? Because I believe that we can be curators and arbiters of knowledge. And where I come from, knowledge is always a form of power. I love how some folks will talk about what it means to think about this sort of radical imagination. The most critical issue, perhaps, facing people, facing communities, is this lack of a radical imagination. Not necessarily the people who are in these communities, but the imagination of individuals who oftentimes are called to work on behalf, called to serve, called to be in community with, right? But oftentimes end up reproducing or reifying power relations. So like this, I think we need to sort of think about what our imagination, how do we imagine what individuals and their potential, the possibilities that exist within individuals and communities. But I think one of our more critical issues is this lack of a radical imagination. I think that we have sentenced ourselves to a way of thinking and moving in the world that is either accepted, advised, or approved. Said differently, we give in to what some folks talk about as a false consciousness, or we believe only in things that seem attainable or within reason. This false consciousness, it impedes our lack of a radical imagination, because we're always seeking the go-ahead, right? We're always seeking the affirmation to do the things that I believe that we are capable of doing, that people are calling on us to sort of think about. I think when I think we're conditioned to seek comfort, right? We're conditioned toward comforting sorts of practices in our world. And as we move away from notions of comfort, we can become more responsive to the agency we have to do the work I believe that we are capable of doing. And so when we take our power and we fuse it with our agency, I believe that we can do the extraordinary. What power do you have? What do you want? What power do you have? And this final question that I'll leave you with, what are you willing to give up? I'll end where I started. And that's really sort of thinking about what it means to move closer to a more just, livable world, right? I think it's easy to get caught up in the motion of life, going, responding, doing, deadlines, production, right? All these things I think are competing for us, right, as commodities in this sort of capitalistic marketplace, right? And it gets us away from our core self. Right? And so a lot of my work is really concerned with what it means to engage in notions of self-definition, right? Which is to say, how might we exist differently in our bodies, right? In this historical moment and into the futures. One of the more particular questions I've asked partners recently is this about this idea of love. What does it mean to engage in practices of love? As an example, I think, of what I'm talking about, I asked some partners, some students, to consider the sound, the look, and the feeling of love as a practice, self-love. They told me that they have never had this space. No one has ever sort of engaged them with that question, right? Which says to me that our educative practices are oftentimes our policies, they move away from notions of the core self. They don't allow the sort of reflective time and to consider questions, right, that are at our core, right? To be clear, it's very, I think folks can intellectualize this idea, right? There are ways that individuals can talk about notions of love or self-love, I think in really sort of creative and expansive ways, but I'm much more interested in how individuals understand what it feels like, right, to be loved. What is the sound? Again, the look, the feeling of it. I think there are ways that we need to come around notions of love in way beyond the romantic and beyond the cursory sort of understanding, such that we can understand it as a life-sustaining sort of force. And I think we can only get to that particular place with moments of pause, with moments of deep reflexivity, with questions that ask us to get at the self. Right. And so if I'm thinking about what we need to be willing to give up, I think we need to be willing to move away, to get away from the sorts of practices that move us away from the core self, right? That don't allow us to recognize as humanity in others and in ourselves, right? We might release ourselves from the grind and the pressures of society that are unwilling to recognize our need for rest, that are unwilling to recognize our need for connection and community, and again, compassion for the self, for care, right? And responsibility for the respect of the self, right? These broad ideas that I think love encompasses. And so what is it that you want? What power do you have? What are you willing to give up? I don't promise that any of the habits and or the questions that I'm proposing are easy or simple, but I do believe, again, that they can help move us toward more livable and sustainable futures, not only for ourselves, but the individuals that we are in community with. And so with that, I want to pause. With about the 15 minutes remaining, I want to open it up to any questions that you might have. Thank you all so much for your time and attention.
I see a question. Okay, we have a question in the chat. See Q&A. Can you see it, Dr. Okello? Okay.
I cannot see that.
I appreciate the invitations and the lessons you have offered today. I am wondering if you can consider times you have invested in collective care and mutual aid, and specifically, what have you gained emotionally, spiritually, or materially from those kinds of commitments to others?
I really appreciate that question. And I think for me, I've been reminded more than anything of, I think I'll say this, I think we're oftentimes conditioned to figure out how we are going to make it through the day, through the week, through life on our own, right? So much of, I think, scholarship and the ways in which we're socialized, they train us away from not only the core self, but they train us away from this need for people, right? We invest in notions of individualism and further away from collective ideas like mutual aid, mutual care, compassion, these sorts of ideals, right? Toward, and then again, I think a marketplace that desires to celebrate the I, right? If I'm drawing on and thinking about sort of Black communities, communities of color, Indigenous communities, I'm thinking about the ways in which individuals have always sort of been collected or invested in the we, right? They've understood that the I was not sustainable, right? That there could be no sense of I in this sort of Western United States society, right? The notion was incompatible, right, with what it meant to live. And so, so as I'm thinking about these sort of communities, as I'm thinking about my own sort of communities, I have found senses of restoration. I found beautiful reminders of what it meant to be heard, to be listened to with compassion, to be forgiven. I've been sort of reminded of a sense that I am a whole person, right, beyond the things that I produce, right, for you know, a university, for people, right? I'm more than this sort of commodity, more than production, but that I have value that escapes all of that, right? That I'm cared for beyond that in some really beautiful ways. And so more than anything, it's the beautiful reminders of the what else, of the living outside of again, the modes of production that I think that we're oftentimes called into. So I've been able to consider more than just notions of care, but notions of healing, right? And so I think, again, if we're thinking about the sort of marketplace that we exist in, notions of care get read as sort of a sustainable practice. And for me, I'm really trying to sort of think about the place, the idea of healing as a core practice that requires something more substantive, right? Requires relation, it requires connection, requires time for really sort of just deep reflexive practice, right? And so the habits that I'm talking about, the questions that I'm posing are really sort of questions that are pointing to a different ideal, right? But also, I think something that allows us to live into something that's more sustainable for ourselves, right? And so, yeah, those are sort of the thoughts that come to mind. Thank you for that question.
We have another question in the room. Can you hear us?
I can, yes.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Cece Bates. This is such a great way to end the day. I really appreciate your talk and took lots of notes. And I have a question about the question, what are you willing to give up? Thank you. So what are you willing to give up? And so I took some notes at another point when you were talking about consequential living. You posed the question about what do you need to refuse in your life? And then I'm also thinking, like, so circling back to the end to what are you willing to give up? I'm wondering about the ways in which those are connected. And what I was wondering is, I'm thinking about the ways we give up, right? So I give up things intentionally, make choices. And maybe that goes along with refusing, right? And making intentional choices. But I was also thinking about, like, what are you willing to give up? It's a sacrifice. Like, I don't make those choices and I give things up because of other things that creep in. So can you talk a little bit about when you pose that question, what are you willing to give up? Is it all of those things, or is it one or the other? Can you elaborate on that, please? And again, thank you for your time. That makes sense too, I hope.
It does. It does. I think that's a beautiful. I appreciate really the connections that you're making across the comments. When I think about this question of what are you willing to give up, I absolutely do read it as a question of refusal, right? I think we're making intentional, really deliberate decisions about what is or is not sustainable, right? And I think there's sort of a willingness to let go of something, as I mentioned earlier, allows us to affirm or say yes to the things that I think we desperately need, right? The core practices that I think could be more useful, more move us towards something more sustainable, right? And so, if I'm understanding your question, I think that there are absolutely there's absolutely a stance or a practice of refusal embedded in this question of giving up or letting go or moving away from the things that that mean us harm, right? And such that we can invite other ways of being into our life and into sort of our life worlds, as I think about sort of communities. And so, I hope that really just affirms what you just sort of repeated back. But I say all that to say that I agree with how you're making sense of the ideas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Checking the chat because I can't see what we have. Okay. So anyone else who is on the webinar, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We can see it. We only have a few more minutes. Dr. Okello.
Dr. Okello, this is the director of the Institute that's hosting you. So happy that you're here.
Thank you.
I apologize. I was in and out because we have two sessions that are almost back to back. So a lot of what you said I didn't hear. So I'm not going to pretend like I was in the room. But there is a question that based on something you said when I was in the room, that I thought it was, first of all, I was really happy that you started everything with the Rock River and Tree, which I hold that poem very dear. But I do recognize that societal wise, we promote individualism, and in particular in our society. I'm well aware that in other societies, that's not always the case. And I'm wondering how much of the issues that we have with values is attached to our societal perspective, particularly in America, of individualism and just kind of, you know, I got mine, you get yours the best way you can.
Mhm. Thank you, Dr. McCoy, and I really appreciate the work you're doing with the Institute and the support of this conference. And yes, really excited to be part of the conversation. Thank you for your work. And that question, you know, I think I think your assessment is fair. That you sort of you posed it as a question, but really I heard it as a statement, right? That there's something about what it means to exist in a Western United States context that is an extension of European colonialism and coloniality, which is rooted in anti-Blackness and imperialism and colonial, like these ideas, these systems of oppression serve as the very sort of bedrock for what we understand as United States culture, and sort of the general epistemology for how we move, how we think, right, in the United States, if we're talking about the United States in particular, right? So understanding that that's the anchor, that's the bedrock, right? That's what our sort of our form of governance is tied to these particular cornerstones, if you will. Then I think that we are always and already being the idea of individualism is always and already projected onto us, right? That is the general expectation. That is the what it means to be mobile in society, what it means to be upwardly mobile, what it means to be successful. All these sort of conditions of being are tied to this underlining general epistemology for that values particular forms of humanism, that values particular ways of being, right? That's tied to the very things that you're talking about. And so, I say all that to say that part of this is the culture. Part of this is the epistemology, the guiding epistemology, and there are alternatives, right? There are ways that individuals, that communities have thought otherwise, that have pushed against the thing that is thrust upon them, right? These ideals or ways of being are not particularly valued for in society, and we might even say that they're not valued in a consistently in education context, right? We socialize students. We all been socialized into particular ways of being that are consistent with this sort of notion of individualism. And right, I think some of the habits that I was sort of talking about as I'm looking at a question in the chat from Dr. Wagner, thank you for being here. As I think about what we have the possibility to do in the classroom, right, in institute, in sort of situations like this, is to imagine an otherwise form of being, an otherwise way of being, right? That is to say that this is the expectation, this is the world that we exist in, and I want to believe in a world that says that these don't have to be, this isn't it. This doesn't have to be it. And so when I was talking about the possibility model that I know sort of moving across the Clemson University community, I think about Dr. Wagner, I think about the other individuals who move in spaces that invite us to think and consider what and how we can be differently, right? And so when I think about, I'm thinking about, that's sort of the response I have to your question. And if I'm going to respond to the question about that's in the chat, how might we bring these commitments into our teaching? I like to think about the classroom as this a site of possibility. And so drawing on Black epistemologies in particular, I think about the 1960s moment. And I'm thinking about a particular image in Greensboro in 1960 at the lunch counter. And these the individuals who are sitting there have a particular they have a sense of a stoic look on their face. They have a sense of clarity and focus about why they are at that particular lunch counter. What I know about that moment is that the individuals who are pictured, right, in a sense of calm and clarity, didn't just get to that particular moment. Those individuals were committed to a form of practice beyond the moment, which is to say that those individuals, folks who are part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, folks who were the youth, right, college students who were invested in that type of sort of public work, were literally behind the scenes in church basements. They were in places that were churches. They were in basements. They were in other places where they were literally practicing what it would look like for them to encounter hostility. They practiced what it meant to be shaken. They practiced what it meant for individuals to, exact, to deploy epithets and other forms of harm. Right? They were literally engaged in how can we condition ourselves, right, govern ourselves in this moment such that once we leave this place, that we are prepared in some way for what we are going to encounter. And I want to think about the classroom as this site of rehearsal, of practice, of considering what it means to be consistent, how we might take up and embrace the notion that consequential work has to move beyond just this moment, that we might think about how we embrace and care for one another such that once we leave this place, right, that we can begin to move in ways that are already invested in collaboration and the collective, right? That we can move with courage, that we can begin to espouse and utter, even if it's not, even if we fumble over our words in the classroom, but we're rehearsing, right? We're gaining confidence in what it means for our voice to what our voice sounds like in public spaces, so that when you go to the school board meeting, right, or when you show up, in some other public space, that you have literally already sort of taken up the work that's necessary for you to be there. So those are some of the things I'm thinking about as it relates to your question, Dr. Wagner and Dr. McCoy. Yes, Dr. Wagner, literal rehearsals of how we want to be in the world.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Dr. Okello. We have really enjoyed having you here.